Hello everyone, welcome back. You're watching Empyrion Galactic Survival episode 161. I'm Enigmius, and today, looking at a very different ship from the one that we had in the last episode, at least color-wise. We've also added some structural elements, just kind of evolving the whole look of the ship. I never really intended to leave it as kind of like a flat dome and just call it done. There was always in my mind the plan to extend certain segments and kind of make things stick out a little bit more than they did. And I also, as you can see, I painted it, and in the process of doing that I came up with the name for the ship, which is the Copperhead, because this orange that I've been using as a contrasting color against the black started looking very much like copper. And the irony is that it's not even shiny, it's the same flat texture that I painted the black on, and it's just, it for me looks very much like copper, especially up in these areas here, just because of the way the shadows are kind of working. Down here, not so much copper, looks a lot like orange, but up here, very much like copper. Thus the Copperhead. I was originally going to call it the Cobra, because this area here reminded me of a snake's head, and then the flat section, the dome, kind of reminded me of like a cobra's hood. So there was that element to it. But I ultimately decided that the Copperhead was going to be the name because just the way the color stood out for me. I said that's got to be it. So we're going to look at some of the details that I've added since the last episode. We're going to talk about some tips on the inside for making things a little bit easier for finishing that off. And then we're going to look at some of the detailing in time-lapse form for the exterior, and kind of at least getting that underway so you can see what's going on. It's probably going to undergo a number of revisions between now and the time the blueprint comes out, but at least you'll get a pretty good idea of the overall goal, and how we specifically achieve that might change. So the first big change that I made, as you've probably already noticed, is this section. It kind of starts towards the back, and it's just a raised section from what we had previously, and it comes down here and sort of sticks out from the front, and then it goes back underneath. And we're gonna get out our flashlight so you can actually see in a little better detail. I love the fact that everything is very, very dark when you've got the flat texture and the black paint, but it's not so great for seeing detail and sort of how things come together. So, you know, nothing especially complicated. We've been doing this in a lot of my builds lately, is just kind of bringing things out from the primary hull to make things look a little bit more interesting. It's got some glass, which is, as you may know, very uncommon for me, and I can see I missed painting two of the panes on this side, and of course mirror mode would have got those two. I kind of like it, and I've decided that what I'm going to do is, obviously we're going to keep this glass here. We may incorporate glass in some other areas of the build as well, and then I'll just make sure that whatever happens with the glass will have something going on in the background that will prevent from making it too easy to just shoot through the glass and then start making a mess of the inside with all of our sensitive and crucial ship equipment. That to me is better than leaving it the way it is now. I could also just get rid of the glass and cover it all up, but at this point I think we might as well stick with it because it's working for me. So we've got that front section, and I'm pretty happy with it. I started using these four-sided slope blocks. You can see it's 22.5 degrees that way. There's two blocks to do that, and then 22.5 degrees that way, but it's still four-sided, as opposed to the common block combination that I would normally use, which is this one here, the three-sided one, and then the tip, and that makes the kind of compound 22.5 degree slope with the 45 degree sort of transition in here, and it's actually used to very regular effect. And we'll just cheat a little bit here, right in here. We'll just get rid of that. There's an example of it in use, sort of as part of the shape. Very, very common. I use it all the time, and I probably will continue to use it all the time. But then we have these blocks here, the four-sided sort of shape. Most of the time when I've tried to use this in the past, I've found that it's a little bit difficult to manage the transitions. You have to be very, very selective about where you use them. You can't use them like in an area like this It just doesn't work with the 4 sides. But for something like this, let me get the block out of the way, I feel it works really well. And in fact, when I look at it, sort of part and parcel of the whole thing, and when we're talking about naming the ship after a snake, it does kind of add that angular, almost fang kind of thing. Realistically, if it was a real snake made out of hardened steel, the fangs would be underneath here somewhere. But I think it works to have these little angular bits, kind of relatively subtle, but coming down and doing what they do. And I just wanted to kind of point out that that's what I used to make that happen. Moving towards the back, I've also got these sort of sections. And let's just make sure we're doing our best for the lighting here. They're the same on both sides. They're mirrored. Nothing different on one side relative to the other. And again, it's basically the same thing that we did up here and the same thing that we've been doing in a lot of our other ship designs. It's just kind of extending things out a little bit and then taking a look at how it's going to come around and wrap around here so that it has its own profile. You can see it kind of goes like that and then tucks underneath here and then goes a little ways before it merges with the underside of the ship and it doesn't really stick out anymore. It's just a little bit of structural detail, whereas previously it might have been a little bit too repetitious and a little bit too bland on this back side. I mean, there's a fair bit of detail with all of these layers going on and the different angles and things as they transition around. But this to me just adds a little extra something that's hard to do with anything else. So that was the majority of the structural work that I've done since the last episode. I was thinking about adding more raised details on the back here, like down the middle, but with what we're going to be doing a little later this episode, I decided to leave it for now, and we'll evaluate later whether or not we want to add anything else. I could see possibly adding just a strip down the back here, starting maybe in the middle of this raised section here and then down, but I won't start on that until we get everything else underway. Now, the one thing that I wanted to point out, if we kind of scoot in here, you can see it's very blue and gray. What I did when I went around and got the outside ready for painting was I used the texture gun set to texture the entire block. So whatever block you hit, the whole thing gets textured, all the different faces. And the end result of doing that is when we've got when we're working from the exterior, and then we've got, in most cases, barely a block thick, you can see on the inside where all of those situations are, where it's just one block thick, which is kind of, first of all, an indication that probably wanting a little bit more armor in these areas for the defensive aspect of things. And that by itself can be pretty significant. Obviously, you don't want to put yourself in a bad situation where it's very, very easy for anyone to just shoot a hole through your ship and then start making a mess of the insides. The other thing that it helps when it comes to finishing off the inside is that there's always kind of the opportunity when I'm working around stuff like this. I mean, you can see this is a fairly intricate collection of blocks that we're going to have to work through, probably in layers, just the way, similar to what we did on the outside, just to smooth everything off and give it that finished appearance, because this definitely doesn't look finished. In the process of doing this and making the transition smooth and getting everything taken care of the way that we might like to, what quite often ends up happening is we have to remove certain blocks. And when we don't know what's going on the outside of the ship because we're inside, it's very easy to remove a block that then leaves a hole in the hull because it was an important piece of the exterior structure. Very easy to see now which blocks are directly related to the exterior structure. In other words, don't remove any of the blue blocks because they're going to be something that creates a hole in the hull that you'll have to replace. And wherever you see blue blocks is where the armor is especially thin, so maybe you want to bulk it up as part of the plan of finishing off the interior. So that was kind of a useful thing that I came across. Look at this floor. This floor is just a disaster waiting to happen, especially here. I mean, it's the underside of a hover vessel, so I wouldn't expect to see problems from things like drones or even, other players in a PvP environment, because they'd have to fly obviously under the ship to get here. But still, that's making it a little too easy. So, Having shown you all of that, everything that we've done since the last episode, and this little tip for the inside, texturing or painting the entire block as you go around on the outside and use that as an indicator for what's going on in here, the next step is to get down to the business of the time-lapse and start working on the main element of the exterior detailing that I was most enthusiastic about when we started this build. Now this segment, I want to focus mostly on actual painting and texturing. And we've talked about this a fair bit with previous builds around the time that we're working on the painting and texturing, but it's always been in the context of why we chose certain colors, why we chose certain textures. Never really looked at the actual mechanics of painting and using the tools available to us to maybe save a little bit of time, be able to do things a little bit quicker and easier. At the beginning of the video, we were looking at what happens when you use the whole block setting on the texture gun and then go around and texture the exterior of the ship. When you go inside, you get kind of an indication of what's going on the outside, because that textures are now reflected also on the inside. That can be kind of a useful sort of thing. But the more direct and practical benefit of that feature, being able to choose between painting or texturing the entire block or painting and texturing just one face, if we set it up properly, it can be a huge time saver. So what we're setting up here structurally is that kind of extruded rib thing. And I know we've been doing a lot of this in a lot of different builds. I like it, but this by no stretch of the imagination represents all that we're going to be doing on the exterior. This is actually just a drop in the bucket compared to what I have in mind. It wasn't even what I had planned on doing for this segment, but I started doing it, and I actually started to have a lot of fun with it, so I decided to roll with it. Next episode we'll be doing even more, and hopefully we'll be taking what we've learned here, especially about the painting and texturing, and applying it in a situation where it really makes a difference in terms of how quickly you can get things done. So we've got these structural elements going into place. They're currently the hardened steel texture and the default light gray color. So when we go around, once it's finished and we start texturing, the whole idea is that I want to match what we've got currently going on in terms of the texture and the colors. We've got two colors on the ship, the orange and the black. The texture across the entire ship is the matte or flat texture, the one that doesn't reflect a whole lot of light. So in order to set this up, we texture the entire block with the flat texture, and then we paint it orange, the entire block, and then we would go back around and we would paint the top section black. And what we get left with is the top section, of course, is black, and then those narrow edges down either side are orange. But we didn't have to aim at those little narrow sections, and we didn't have to do each side individually. We just did it once, and then the second step was apply the black, and we saved a huge amount of time doing it. Then I realized that we're talking about this orange and the way that it's so close to copper when it's in certain light and certain shadow, and I realized copper is shiny, so maybe it would look better in the long run if we'd set up the whole thing to be shiny. So that's what I did. I went around and I switched the texture of all of the orange to the gloss texture, like here for example, and then for that second pass we just have to switch the top face to the flat texture, paint it black, then it matches the rest of the ship. The orange is shiny, and it just takes two passes. It's quick and it's easy, and you're aiming at the widest section of the block, so you don't have to worry about the finicky business of hitting these little wee tiny profiles like you can see on some of these edges here. If you had to paint those manually, which I've done many times, believe me, it takes a long time, and a lot of it is just aiming to make sure that you hit the right section of the block because it's so tiny. So this here is not only saving us time because we're doing fewer passes, we're doing 2 passes instead of 3 to hit everything that we want, but also because we can aim for a larger section of the block and we don't have to waste time aiming for the little wee tiny segments. Simple, straightforward. But if you don't sort of organize it in a way that makes sense, you can lose the benefit of these different things, being able to choose whether you want to hit the whole block or just one face, things like that. Thinking of things in terms of layers, you may not be able to take advantage of it. So I'm hopeful that by passing that along to you guys, you will be able to take advantage of it, thinking in terms of layers. And the first layer is the one that's going to cover the color and the texture that you see on the most faces on that block. So using our example here, we've got 3 exposed faces on each block. 2 faces are orange, glossy, 1 face is flat black. So the first one we do is the one with the most exposed faces, the orange. Then we do the black as the second layer. Bob's your uncle. Everything's happy and done. So now we've got this sort of thing going on where we've done the long, mostly flat areas of this detail, doing the ribs in the extrusion and all that other stuff in order to make things look the way that we want it to. And then we get to this back section where things start to get a little bit more angled. And one of the things that I was noticing is that if I did it wrong and if I wasn't consistent in the way that I was doing it, this really neat sort of look you can see now, very briefly, you know, you take a step back and you take a look at the whole ship at once. That long, narrow, snaky bit that looks so cool, if it's done improperly, if it's got a lot of inconsistencies on it, things very different from one rib to the next, so to speak, it stands out, and not in the good ways. So it took a little bit of time sort of messing about to come up with some of the profiles that we could use. So we end up with basically one profile for when we're on a flat top section, and then when we've got angles and slopes and things that we're dealing with, we have another profile. And it seemed to work pretty well. One of the things I'll just point out, you can see we've got some weird paint, the orange, those 2 wedges there, probably standing out. That's a result of using the mirror mode for painting, because the way that those kinds of blocks work is there are 2 faces that are counted as one and they wrap around. So when you paint it on one side, it looks like you've got it exactly the way that it's supposed to, but it's mirrored on the other side, so you end up with the wraparound kind of messing things up. So you get it right on one side, you go to the other side and it looks wrong. So you fix it on that side, and because mirror mode, then you go back to the first side and now it's wrong because you changed it on the other side. So if you encounter that situation and you're wondering what the hell is going on, these 2 here, the trick to fix it is to turn off mirror mode, paint them or texture them or both the way that you need to, and then turn mirror mode back on. It won't be such a pain in the ass. Now, because we're kind of getting into the experimental category with a lot of these profiles, once I got this back sloped section sort of sorted out, we got the profile working in a way that we were happy with. You can see it just keeps changing back and forth. It flops around. Once we get this done, I started to think about the rest of the top section here and how I want it to work. And basically, if you saw my video where we were looking at the weave, the woven sort of thing that we put together with some of the really flat flat blocks, the slopes and the walls and things like that, that's what we're going to be doing over as much of the hull as possible once we get this ribbed section done. But it's a matter of figuring out how far we have to take those ribs before they don't make sense anymore. And because we're not talking about big squares or big rectangles where it's very easy to put that sort of woven pattern in place, it'll also be a question of how we can manage the transitions from the angular bits on the hull as they currently sit to the woven bits. And we'll be doing some weird stuff with the shapes and stuff like that, so that we have a profile that follows the contours of the hull, and then the scaled or woven parts will be built out from that. Now, if that's not making a lot of sense to you, that's fine, because that's the whole reason why we show it to you. And that's what we will be looking at in the next episode, is that sort of woven sort of thing. We'll do a little bit more to finish off the ribbed areas, and then we'll be switching over to the woven sort of texturing, get as much of that done as possible so we can let it sit while we're working on other things, as we do so often, and make sure that we're happy with the patterns and things that we chose for the weave before we move on and call it done. So if you want to be notified about the next video and future videos in this and other series, the easiest way to do that is to to subscribe to my channel or follow me on social media. One of the things I've been doing on Twitter a little bit lately is putting out sort of sneak peek screenshots of things that I've been working on. So if you're interested in that thing, Twitter is where you'll find those. I don't do it all the time, but just a little something to add a little bit of interest to the otherwise video announcement related feed. If you have any comments or feedback, feel free to leave it below. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.